wherever you are around the world to talk about some recent work of the InterAcademy Partnership. And I'm joined from some of my colleagues from the InterAcademy leadership team to be able to help answer questions and talk further about our work. We mainly want to present briefly an overview of the report and our findings, and then have time for questions and discussion with all of you. We undertook this project, really for two main reasons. We wanted to take a look at some of the themes that have been raised in the G20 and G8 science activities, reports, and recommendations, and then also to look at trends over time and to see which of the reports and recommendations seem to have been taken up in the final GS and G20 reports and recommendations, how the science activities influenced the final activities, and also if there were trends over time in terms of certain themes, certain areas of focus, how things evolved, and if there seemed to be areas where there was particular emphasis or areas where there were gaps. And we did not intend this to be, a really major analytic activity that would delve deeply into the process in each country, or really try to delve into motivations or any other aspect of the work. It was really just looking at the existing data and undertaking an analysis, looking as much at correlations as at causation, but trying to identify useful information and useful trends. It really hadn't been done before, and we felt that given how time intensive and resource intensive these activities are, it would be nice to understand more about the issues that had been focused on and the trends. And it would be really useful to be able to use this information to help other countries that are beginning to work on G20 S20 activities. And I think, that we produce some quite interesting information that, as I said, is data-driven. There are no speculations about the relationship of the observed correlations, but the correlations do provide insights and food for thought as we examined the S and G statements, the topics examined, and the trends. And that's really what we want to talk with you about today. And I'm very happy to be able to turn over to our colleague, Ben Bleasdale, I hope I pronounced the last name correctly, who worked very hard with us to help generate the important data for analysis and to undertake the analysis and put together the report that we're going to share with you today. So why don't I turn it over to Ben? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peggy. And really nice to speak to everybody today and share a little bit more of an insight into the really interesting findings that have come out of this report. And as Peggy's very much said, I think it's very much food for thought for us to go away and digest. And I think there's lots of interesting trends and themes that we can really draw on. So I lead a small research agency called Culturebase, and we've been really delighted to be working with IAP to deliver this piece of work. What I'm going to do is just take you through some slides that lay out some of the core findings of the actual report itself, but also a bit of the methodology and how we've arrived at these. and a few of the kind of conclusions that we're drawing from it at this point. So I will just load up the slides. Wonderful. So as has been mentioned, this project was very much looking at the combination of S statements and G statements. I'm sure I don't need to explain what those are to everyone on the call, but by S statements, we're very much referring to the body of documents that are produced by the G7 and G20 national academies, and that are then fed into the G7 and G20 summits, respectively. And by G statements, we're referring to the body of documents that then are produced at each of those summits that come out. So we're really trying to study the relationships and the correlations between those two bodies of statements across time, and to be able to really understand whether or not there are correlations in what themes are being mentioned and how those two sets of documents connect together. So this was very much spurred, this project, by a desire to better understand the relationship between those two sets of statements and to look at correlations. As Peggy's very rightly pointed out, we are very much looking at correlations. There are some interesting thoughts around causation between some of these things, but what we've got here today is some data that is looking at links and trends. And what we've been able to do is catalog the themes that have been appearing across the S statements as they were produced, and then map that against the themes that appear in subsequent G statements, and to begin to see patterns between those two. And what we really wanted to understand was there a continuity of themes across those two bodies? How did that map onto big global issues around SDGs or Paris climate agreements, or the appearance of COVID? Like, what were the kind of external influences, and how did that affect some of the trends that we see? So in terms of the methodology and what I'm going to show you today, we very much focused down on a time window of 2013 to 2023 to give ourselves a kind of time-bound sample to be able to look at. And what we did is collate together all of the primary outputs, both of the S statements and the respective G statements per year. And in total, you can see that this involved around 46 documents for the S statements and around 76 for the G statements. It's worth saying that we really wanted to do it this way so that we could accommodate the fact that year to year, there's quite a lot of variance in how many documents are produced, particularly in the G statements. So we've really tried to kind of draw together the main outputs of communiques, action plans, and be quite flexible about what output format was used in any particular year, but to really study it as a body of documents coming out each year. And then just to say, as we move through, you'll see that we've used a two-tier system for understanding the themes and how they're mentioned. And what we've been looking at is this idea of a major theme, which would be a kind of headline topic or something that was a focus of major recommendations that particular year. But then also we wanted to be able to capture what we've called minor themes, which are the passing reference to particular topics, whether that's their reference as context or examples, whether perhaps isn't that kind of depth of engagement, but it does demonstrate that these themes were in the minds of those putting together the S statements or the G statements, that they were something that were in the political conversation at that time. So you'll see that we've really tried to kind of capture the distinctions between how topics are mentioned as well as whether they were mentioned at all. So what we've been able to show through analyzing the statements is that we've identified 42 themes in total. These will be very familiar topics, I'm sure, to everyone on the call, but we've tried to group them into 6 broad categories to make it a bit easier to understand the kind of level of engagement and the level of activity under each of these. These span across environment, health, socioeconomic issues, the science system itself, connections between science and society, and then emerging technologies. And there's a whole range of different topics under here, which I'm sure will be familiar to you, but we really think that this allows us to look at these kind of high-level themes and how they're emerging in some of the different statements. So what I'm going to do is go through each of those 6 in turn and give you a bit of a sense of the top line findings, but I really encourage you to have a look at the actual report itself. I've seen that Ryan has added the link into the chat. That really delves into more depth of some of the findings and helps you have a look at the data yourself and be able to kind of make your own interpretations. Throughout what I'm going to show you on the next few slides, we've used a really standardized data visualization approach. as you can see, there's quite a lot of data to capture. So we've been thinking very carefully about how to be able to show this longitudinally across the different years, to capture that kind of major mentions and minor mentions, and also to represent both the S and the G statements next to each other so that we can look at those kind of correlations. So the layout that you see here is a bit of an example, just as a guidance for what you're going to see on the next few slides. We have each theme is listed on the far left. So in this case, it's biodiversity. What we then do is lay together the S statements themes and the G statement themes below per year across. And what we've done is group each S statement year and each G statement year in total. So all of the different outputs that came out in 2013 in the S statements are grouped together, and what you're seeing it as amalgamated data. And then what we've used is a color gradient to indicate whether or not it was a major mention in the kind of deeper, denser color, or a minor mention, which is here in the lighter color. So what you'll be able to see hopefully in the coming slides is that you can begin to look across these tables and see the patterns of when mentions are coming up, first perhaps in the S statements and then being reflected subsequently either that same year or subsequent years in the G statements. And we think visualizing the data this way makes it a little bit easier to pick out those patterns and see some of those kind of overall correlations. So let's go through those 6 categories. We're going to start with environment. Here you can see we've got a whole range of very different topics, from oceans, biodiversity, climate change, food systems, polar science, and water systems. And what we see here is a really interesting set of trends. I mean, from the very start, we can certainly say that environment themes are really common features, both across S and G statements, which I don't think will be unexpected. In particular, climate change and food systems, very, very common. There's, very few years where these aren't mentioned. What we are seeing, if you look across this set of data, is over time, you see an emergence of a kind of merged set of connected themes around climate change, food systems, biodiversity, and oceans, which are really starting to kind of move in lockstep. So we really see them coming up consistently together as the years go by. And I think that really represents a kind of the broadening and the merging of the debate around particularly climate change and its effects, and a really kind of holistic view of how environment themes are considered. What we can see in terms of the sequencing of mentions is that for the topics of biodiversity and oceans in particular, we see that activity in the S statements tends to precede quite sustained activity in the G statements, which is really positive. That shows a kind of really interesting correlation of S statements feeding through into G statement conversations. Whereas as a contrast, you can see for polar science and water systems, the activity is more sporadic, and that we don't really see that kind of correlative relationship perhaps happening across the S and the G statements, and it seems to be much more unrelated mentions across the two. So some really interesting kind of divergences on the themes here, but it's worth noting that we do see that kind of broad spike in 2015 where you can see the column there really lights up across lots of these topics. And it's worth mentioning that there's a real sense across a lot of these data tables that you can see big external drivers of things like the Paris Agreement, the SDGs launching, which was in 2015, really driving attention to particular topics. So it's worth bearing in mind that we can really draw out some external factors driving a lot of this activity. So to move on to health, here again, a very large category, but a whole range of different things from AMR to One Health, aging, COVID-19, you can imagine really appearing towards the latter half of this data set, but also some smaller topics around things like neuroscience, neglected tropical diseases, some real spread here of different types of topics. And again, we see some really interesting trends. I think in particular, I always draw my eye towards health equity and access here, which has really consistent, impressively consistent activity within the G statements. And that's actually despite relatively modest activity in the S statements, suggesting that's a really nice example of a topic that's really captured the attention of policymakers and actually is being kind of included in G statement conversations with relatively little pressure from the S statement side. We're also seeing topics like aging, where it's a more periodic topic, and that we don't see that synchronicity quite so strongly, suggesting again that it might well be that activity on that is driven much more by, for example, host nation priorities that particular year or external political events. So again, it's trying to unpick what's driving some of those activities. And then you've got, for example, here neglected tropical diseases, which is quite an infrequent topic, but that we do see that correlation. So there's a suggestion here that although it's not mentioned very often, when it is, we really see engagement across between the S and the G statement. So a real sense that topics can have their moment in the limelight and they can really see some action and some real engagement. Third, onto the socioeconomic trends. Here we've got, again, quite a diverse set of things from energy, sustainable development, cultural assets, heritage, but also down to things like economic growth, poverty, etc. What we see here is really strong engagement from the G statement side. So both across things like energy, sustainable development, economic growth, and poverty, real perennial issues as G statements. And actually, what we would see is quite a lot more intensity and consistency on the G statement side on those topics compared to the S statement side, suggesting that again that these are real kind of high salience topics for political conversations. We do see quite interesting a bit of a shift from around 2020 onwards, where there does appear to be more S statement activity, and perhaps a hypothesis here is that the kind of appearance of COVID and discussions around kind of how to rebuild economies and intervene has really driven more engagement for evidence on kind of effective activities. So some really interesting kind of findings around that side. Again, you've got these kind of more niche topics, things like disaster resilience, where you do see this kind of less engagement, much more periodic, but again, you do see that kind of correlation between the S and the G, which I think is really interesting. And then, for things like the cultural assets and heritage, we're seeing some slightly different sequencing where you're actually seeing G statement activity preceding S statement mentions, suggesting again that perhaps this topic came to the fore through political interest and that was then backed up with engagement from the S statement side. So again, some very interesting kind of sequencing differences. Fourth, on the science system trends, these are very much looking at some of the sorts of debates around how the science system itself operates, everything from kind of researcher assessment to collaboration, interdisciplinarity, open access. Some really interesting trends here, and you'll see immediately, hopefully, from this chart that there's a real sense of increasing interest as you move across the years here, and particularly from 2016 onwards, a much stronger set of activity across both S and G statements. I think you've got some topics that are more perennial themes, things like collaboration, perhaps not surprising given the forum that these discussions are being had in. But you see others where there is a real sense of kind of correlation around things like open access, careers, funding, um, compared to some where there is less of that kind of link, perhaps around things like interdisciplinarity. You've got some topics that are much more favored in the G statements compared to the S statements, and IP rights is a very interesting one here. Again, a topic that we're seeing a lot of engagement on the G statement side, but not a huge amount of activity on the S statement side. And then again, just to really highlight that, I think there's this really interesting trend here of increasing awareness and engagement in the G statements around these science system trends and these themes, which I think is a really interesting thing to unpick perhaps and take away and muse on, is this idea of increasing awareness amongst policymakers about the factors that underpin scientific excellence and a real sense of engaging with those, particularly from 2016 onwards. So again, a really interesting shift perhaps within the time window we've picked, and one that would be really interesting to investigate further. So the penultimate one is around science and society. This is everything from kind of science literacy, ethics, public involvement, capacity building, trust. And again, I think what we see here is some real shifts that perhaps are linked around the pandemic response, around things like trust in science, evidence-informed policy, which really light up from 2019 and 2020 onwards. We really see kind of consistent correlations here, with S statement activity being followed by G statement mentions. But we also see topics that don't seem to be carrying across, and particularly kind of safe and ethical research doesn't seem to have that same relationship. We also see things that seem to have kind of peaks and troughs. So public involvement and engagement has a real moment in the limelight in the G statements in the kind of mid 2010s, but then seems to kind of tail off despite continued engagement from the S statement side later. So I think, again, there's some really interesting things about what has the zeitgeist at that moment, what captures the political attention in the G statements, and when does that kind of window of discussion end and perhaps ebb away. And then finally, on the kind of emerging tech trends, here we've only got a few small examples on these, but it's quite interesting what trends we do see here. I think it's fair to say that only really AI has had kind of consistent cut through. And I think it's fair to say that we can imagine that really continuing to increase. You can see in the latter years, the right-hand side of this table, that it's a really strong theme coming out of the G statements consistently, and again, getting really strong engagement from the S statement side as well. But it's quite interesting if you see in that kind of artificial intelligence bar at the bottom there that G statement activity, so the lower of the two rows, the mentions start sooner. They start in 2016, strengthen in 2017, and then remain consistent throughout. That actually precedes S statement activity by a couple of years. So it's a really interesting one, perhaps again, to take away and think about, which is where do we see the G statement activity preceding and perhaps driving S statement engagement? And is that linked to these kind of quite unusually rapidly developing topics? And how best can the academies engage with these and provide evidence at the right points for political discussion? So that is the 6 categories, and very keen to kind of discuss and see what people make of those. And I'd really, again, encourage you to have a look at these in the report in more detail. The top line, which hopefully you've taken away from that kind of brief canter through those themes, is that there are a lot of correlations. I think it's really heartening to see the fact that there is an enormous amount of crossover between S and G statements. And although we can't kind of confirm that as a causative relationship, I think the fact that we're seeing really reproducible patterns, I think, is really promising. And I think what we've tried to do as my final kind of input on this is offer a bit of a sense of the modes of kind of influence that we're seeing, the modes of relationship between the S and the G statements. And I just wanted to use the last couple of slides to run through a few of those, which is, looking across all of those 6 categories and all of those 42 themes, do we see some kind of groupings, some kind of commonalities between the themes that tell us a little bit about how the relationship between S and G statements is working in practice? And what we've pulled out is 4 different types of modes, which are, I'll go through these in turn, but this idea of S and G working in parallel, S preceding G activity, S activity not really translating to G activity, and then the fourth one is this idea of G activity actually preceding S activity. So I'll just briefly go through those, and then very keen to kind of wrap up the slides and hear thoughts. In the first one of those, S&G in parallel is very much drawing out the themes where we see really deep, sustained and consistent engagement on a particular theme that is suggesting that it's both a high priority for the S statements, but also really firmly embedded in the mind of policymakers and is showing up in those G statements really consistently. I think what we see is that those themes tend to be things that are really clear, high public saliency priorities, things that are really driven by external factors like crises, and are really kind of something that are right at the top of everybody's minds. So it's really promising there that we are seeing S and G statements working in parallel. It suggests that there's a really close relationship between providing the evidence into the political discussions and that evidence then being heard and used. So I think that's certainly kind of a really good example, I'd say, of a really kind of strong correlation between the 2 statements. The second grouping we have is S statement activity preceding G statement activity. And this is examples of themes where it seems to be useful or necessary to have engagement on the S statement side to drive an issue up the agenda and push through the threshold of the kind of policy making discussion threshold, and to really get things into G statements. And we see a whole range of topics that have this mode of working, and they tend to be ones where that public saliency is perhaps lower, but where there are often really important actions to be taken at a particular point in time. And these cover everything from kind of public involvement, engagement, to things like neglected tropical diseases. And I think what we see is that really clear kind of correlation between S statement activity leading into G statement activity. But what we also see in a lot of these is that when you remove that kind of S statement push or nudge, that the G statement activity also drops. So there is a real sense here that that kind of continuation of that activity is required to keep that political engagement. The other 2 forms that we're seeing are, firstly, themes where that S activity is not translating into G activity. And again, it just doesn't appear to be passing that kind of priority threshold to translate into the political conversations. These are topics that, again, perhaps struggle to either kind of raise their profile sufficiently or to feel like there's very clear policymaker actions or a role for global policymaking perhaps at that particular time. So I think there's some real lessons here for us about, what are the factors that perhaps feed into that lack of translation, and are the things that the academies can do to help ensure that those kind of topics are being heard and being considered in the mix. And then the final and the fourth mode of influencing, it very much links to that kind of emerging tech examples that I mentioned, which is, are the things where G statement activity is preceding S statement activity. And I think we see some really interesting examples in the socioeconomic category, with things like poverty and economic growth being a really active theme for G statements, but much less prominent in the S statements. But also we see this on these kind of emerging topics of things like artificial intelligence, which perhaps is driven by this idea of a topic coming out very quickly and being of high political interest. And there the S statements seem to follow the activity of the G statements. And then the final examples that we see here are also quite technical subjects. So things like intellectual property rights, again, where we see quite sustained G statement activity, but much less so in the S statements. So I will stop there. Those were the four kind of modes of influencing, and I've taken you through the kind of six categories. But just to say that we're really keen to kind of answer any questions on this, but also I do encourage you to go away and have a look at the report that we've produced. I think it's got some really interesting further analysis and delves a bit deeper into some of those trends, but we think there's some really interesting food for thought across this, and hopefully looking forward to hearing your thoughts. So I will stop there, and I think I'm handing over to Stephanie.
Shall I just go ahead?
Please do, Stephanie.
So hello, everybody. For me, it's good afternoon, everybody. I'm speaking today really, well, in my capacity as having been involved in this project, but also because in 2025, my country, South Africa, is hosting the G20 Summit, and our National Academy, the South African Academy of Sciences, is going to be hosting the S20 meeting. So my mandate today is just to express a few views about how we see this going forward. And of course, it is very much a case of looking forward now to how we are going to develop the S20 program and watch how the G20 summit is rolled out and runs in South Africa this year. Just as a little bit of background for the audience, I have been involved with our Academy of Science of South Africa for many years. I have just recently stepped down as the president of the Academy, and I also am a member of the IAP board. So I have been seeing this very much from both sides of all of the activity that's going on at the moment. I also am quite closely linked into our National Department of Science, Innovation and Technology, which is the broad host for a lot of the G20 science meetings. And I think perhaps it's useful to bear in mind that any G20 meeting has the summit being fed, if you like, information input from a number of different fora. It's not only the S20. The S20 forum is very much the forum for academies, for scientists, for excellence in science. But the academies and the S20 is not the only source of information which goes to the G20. And in fact, it's been very interesting for me to see now how our national departments are galvanizing themselves into action around some themes which link closely with what you've just heard. We, as the S20, will be using as our theme for 2025 sustainability and well-being. So the nexus between sustainability and well-being, which of course is illustrated well by a lot of those themes that you've just heard Ben speaking about. But the Department of Science, Innovation and Technology have also taken as a working group a theme on poverty and economic growth, which aligns well with one of the other themes that has come through in what you've been hearing today. And that's just an illustration of the fact that what we have is a very rich tapestry of views, inputs, feeding into information, which will, of course, ultimately, we hope, guide the G20 summit in some of their conclusions. I also wanted to just say that, of course, for us, hosting the S20 in South Africa puts some emphasis, it's not a declared emphasis only, or not exclusive, but an emphasis on the Global South, which I think has not been necessarily all that strong, although in Brazil last year it was. But it also does highlight a number of emerging international themes around, for example, disaster resilience, resilience in the face of climate change, the need to develop the science systems and those aspects of, for example, data science and open access, which were mentioned. I think we're going to see that the emphasis is going to be quite strong on aspects which are particularly relevant for the Global South. In fact, the international conversation tends to include consideration now of the Global South, and I'm looking forward to seeing how that will or won't pan out. We, of course, can't directly influence it and would not want to be exclusive or in any way biased, of course, but it's going to be interesting, I think, to see, in the light of what we know now about how S20 discussions relate to G20 and vice versa, how we're going to go forward with all of that. So just in concluding, I would like to say that we will, of course, welcome the input from all of the academies who are members who will be participating in the S20. Our first meeting is as soon as the end of February, so we are gearing up for that right now. But we, of course, will be interested during the course of the year to hear how all of our partner academies throughout the IAP interact and perhaps contribute to the discussion. There will be webinars and meetings and so on at which we can interact and develop themes or focus areas within our theme, which I hope will be useful and which will be rich in the approaches and the views and the concerns of all of our partner countries. So I think it's going to be an absolutely amazing, interesting, and fascinating time. Thank you. I also will be happy to answer questions when it comes to that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephanie, from these perspectives from South Africa as the current host of the S20 G20 processes. Before we open the floor to questions and comments discussion, let me also say that we have 3 more IAP board members here with us, Diane Negra from Ireland, Masresha Fetener from Ethiopia, who is also the IAP co-president together with Peggy, and Gianfranco Pacchioni. So thank you for being here. I think it indicates the importance of this activity for IAP, which I would add, it's a project that most likely if IAP did not carry out, nobody else would have. I also want to add my thanks, Ben, to you for this collaboration and for all your hard work. Anyone who has a comment or a question, please feel free to raise your electronic hand or your real hand if you turn your camera on, and I will be keeping an eye, or of course you can put your question or comment in the chat. Any questions or comments? I know it was a very clear presentation, but I hope there will be some comments, some reactions. Of course, I invite IAP co-chairs if they want to add their own perspectives. Beate, please go ahead. And please introduce yourself, although I think everybody knows you, Beate.
Yeah, thank you. Rania, it's Beate. I'm the Managing Director of the Global Young Academy. My interest would be whether the active representatives of the participating academies could perhaps share a little light on the process of identifying the topics for the S20 statements. What I think is that there is a negotiating and discussing process in the beginning, and while the G20, to my understanding, is not a very formal organization. It's an organization mainly led by the hosts, and S20 mirrors this. So the host is also the host of the G20. So it would be interesting to see the discussion nationally in the 20 countries and how the whether the academy presidents can share something about this interaction. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Beate. I think, Stephanie, you're in a very good position to respond, but I also I recognize some of the names from other member academies. If you would like to comment, please, you can turn your camera on so that I know that you would like to make a comment. Stephanie?
Yeah, just to say, I think that what develops as a theme or a set of focus areas tends to come partly from discussions which have happened in previous S20 meetings and G20 meetings. So current discussions are informed by the previous discussion, but certainly in this case, what was the focus in the 2024 S20 was developed around, in fact, it had a broad theme, but it also had a number of quite specific sub-themes. And you will have read that set of recommendations which came out of that. It was quite difficult to, at the time, to crystallize that into one set of recommendations. I think that coming out of that has come the theme that we have chosen, and we have discussed it quite widely amongst our own academy members and our own council, and that has evolved out of looking at the last few years and the discussions, and of course the current local, not local conditions, but in global conditions in terms of things like the questions around how far we are with the Sustainable Development Goal agenda, or how far we are not. So my answer is that there isn't one specific prescribed route. I think different academies and different groups of academies deal with this differently, but there is always room for member academies through the IAP, which has observer status at the S20, to make suggestions. And of course, the member academies of the S20 are very welcome. And, you know, I speak for my own academy now, but we would welcome comment from other academies. And of course, that's what the first S20 meeting is really all about. That's the start of where we have all these discussions. And as it goes through, the recommendations that go to the G20 will only be developed later for the November meeting. So there is time to receive comment and to have those discussions.
Thank you, Stephanie. I see Mohammed has his hand up. Is it to comment on this question, or where you want to raise something different, Mohammed?
Well, it's something a little bit different, but rather general.
Sounds good. Diana, so you unmuted. Do you want to comment on this, or we move to Mohammed? No. Okay. Mohammed, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Mohammed Hassan, I am the president of the Sudanese National Academy of Sciences. My question is, I just want to understand whether there is any work that has been done in examining these statements, the G20 G7 statements, to see whether any of the recommendations that have emerged from these statements has been taken up by government for implementation and successfully done so. I think having a statement, of course, is important, but it is not the end of the game. What is important is how the recommendations are implemented. Thank you.
Excellent question. And the short answer from the IAP perspective is that that's not something culture-based looked at. Any representatives from the academies that would like to talk on that, whether they have seen specific recommendations in the S7, G7 or S20 G20 statements being implemented by their own government? If you have any examples. Okay.
Ronnie, I'm speaking a lot and I don't want this to dominate, but I can give you an example from our own government. And that has been the discussion, which has been a long time discussion in the S20 on biodiversity and bioeconomy. And I can tell you that our government department has taken that and does have that as one of its focus areas, and it will in fact be one of the areas which has a working group during this year. But I think the awareness of that connection between biodiversity and bioeconomy has come from academic discussions, the kind of discussions we've had in S20, and I'm sure that that in our own national situation, it has been informed by some of the other discussions.
Thank you, Stephanie. Ruth Cooper from Royal Society, and then Peggy. Oh, you're muted, Ruth.
Sorry, I thought I'd unmuted myself. Thanks, Rania. Thank you all. Pleasure to be on the call and great to see some familiar faces. A couple of points in response to the question about how we selected the topics for our statements. I haven't been involved in S20 when the UK was in the presidency, but have been involved when we ran the S7. And we did that on a consultative basis. We considered what topics were important to the Royal Society. We asked the other S7 academies whether they thought those were useful topics. We also spoke to UK government, not asking for their approval, permission, but to see whether they might be useful. And it was very co-designed. In terms of whether there's been any impact, in answer to Mohammed's question, we're aware that some of the recommendations from a couple of our statements did make it into the government communiqués, and we believe that work has been taken on. And we're pleased to also say that the 3 statements we led on were taken up as IAP statements.
Thank you, Ruth. Peggy?
Yes, well, my comment, really follows directly on what Ruth said and also on what Stephanie said. I do want to first underscore, Orania, your thanks to Ben, who really did an enormous amount of work to put this analysis and report together. And I think, did it in a way that was, extremely thoughtful and professional and very helpful to our thinking about this set of issues and possible future work. The comment I wanted to make was that, one of the things that has been striking to me, both participating in the S20 process that Brazil recently led, observing the process in my own country at a distance, but heading up an important public health agency that had investment in the work and some input into what was going on, and also the work we've done on this recent report. To me, it underscores, how valuable the work of the S8 and S20 is, the ability to convene across scientific organizations and academies and identify critical issues and concerns and opportunities for action, that we need to make sure that whether or not that is reflected in the final work of the GS and G20, whether or not specific continuity of recommendations can be identified, that those reports and that activity of the S8 and S20 is enormously important. And I think, one of the things together we should be thinking about is how to help ensure further dissemination of some of that work in other arenas, because it is so valuable and does reflect, an important synthesis of scientific and policy-making expertise. And I think IAP, really is eager to help in those activities, but it can happen on so many different levels, and just wanted to underscore the importance of that and working together to make sure that some of this time and effort doesn't dissipate, even though it may not be directly reflected in the G20 process. Thank you.
Thank you, Peggy. Diane?
Yeah, I appreciate Peggy's remarks, and it gives me an opportunity to both respond to that a little bit and to circle back to a previous colleague on the issue of dissemination. And I don't have any earth-shattering insights to offer on this point, but speaking as the co-chair of the communication committee and as chair of the statements committee, I just wanted to say that I think there's a very high level of consciousness at the moment about the necessity of, but also the difficulty of circulating these kinds of very significant interventions, and finding ways to do that suit very dramatically altered media environments. And that we have had, quite a few conversations, it seems to me, of late that touch on everything from the semi-collapse of traditional journalism to sometimes the very slow rollout of very useful forms of dissemination that can come, many months or even years after you've produced a piece of work. And admittedly, sometimes it's very frustrating. But I just wanted to highlight that as an important concern and issue. And I think that it's one that it would be fair to say the IAP is thinking a great deal about, at the moment, because we're very aware of the need to find, the most appropriate, rapid and high level forms of dissemination for the good work that's being done under our auspices.
Thank you, Diane, for touching on this. Any other questions or comments from the audience? Okay, I don't see any hands. I don't see any comments in the chat. As you know, we're always available for questions, comments at any time. And maybe I will ask one of our colleagues to put our IAP addresses in the chat as a reminder to anyone. I'm gonna pass the floor back to Peggy to thank everyone and close the meeting. But let me take an opportunity first to thank you for attending and for your comments and questions today. Peggy?
Well, let me just again say thank you to all for participating. Thank you to those who worked on this report, and this is a really, really important set of activities. I think we all appreciate the critical role of science in all our lives, in the health and well-being of our countries, the driver of economies and innovation, and the importance of policymaker engagement as well as public engagement in all of the work that we as science, medicine, and engineering academies do. And so we see this for the InterAcademy Partnership as an important activity that we've undertaken, one of many, and an activity that we see as being critically done in partnership with the academies that compose the InterAcademy Partnership, and we're eager to work with academies in ways big and small to advance all of our missions, especially at this critical time, and hope that the year 2025 will be a good one for all of us and for advancing science. Thank you.